Nightmare Alley destroyed Tyrone Power's matinee idol career and nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox when the studio realized too late that America's biggest romantic star had tricked them into financing a nihilistic descent into alcoholism, fraud, and spiritual rot that ended with the hero groveling in his own vomit as a circus geek. We are digging into the wreckage of Nightmare Alley with 20 secrets the studio tried to bury, including the blackmail power used to force production after Fox executives called the script career suicide, the real carnival geek whose testimony inspired the novel's most disturbing scenes, and the censorship battle that forced the removal of the original ending where Power's character drinks himself to death in a gutter. The screenplay was adapted by Jules Furthman from William Gresham's 1946 novel Nightmare Alley, a best-selling sensation that had shocked readers with its unflinching portrait of carnival con artists, spiritual charlatans, and the American underclass. The original working title remained unchanged because Gresham's novel had generated such notoriety that the title carried instant recognition and controversial cachet. Furthman, a legendary screenwriter who had worked with Josef von Sternberg and Howard Hawks, was commissioned by producer George Jessel to translate Gresham's baroque prose and labyrinthine plot into filmable form. Gresham's research had involved months embedded in traveling carnivals, interviewing sideshow performers, mentalists, and the alcoholic drifters who worked as roustabouts. Most disturbingly, Gresham had interviewed an actual geek, a carnival attraction where a man dressed as a wild savage bit the heads off live chickens, who described how he descended from legitimate performer to degraded spectacle through alcoholism and desperation. This testimony became the emotional and moral center of Gresham's novel, the revelation that the geek wasn't born a monster, but was created by a system that exploited human desperation for profit and entertainment. But the real problem wasn't adapting the novel. It was convincing 20th Century Fox to produce it. Tyrone Power, the studio's biggest star and highest paid actor, had spent a decade playing swashbuckling heroes, romantic leads, and noble gentlemen in technicolor spectacles that made millions. Power was exhausted by this typecasting and desperate to prove he could handle serious dramatic material after returning from military service in World War II. He'd optioned Gresham's novel personally and brought it to studio head Darryl Zanuck, demanding Fox produce it as his next vehicle. Zanuck was horrified. He read the novel as a commercial and artistic disaster, a dark, cynical story with no heroic characters, no romance, and an ending where the protagonist is reduced to the very geek act that had haunted him. Zanuck told Power the role was career suicide, and that Fox wouldn't finance it under any circumstances. Power responded with what amounted to professional blackmail. He would refuse to honor his contract for any other role until Fox agreed to make Nightmare Alley, and he would publicly accuse the studio of artistic cowardice if they tried to suspend him. What changed Zanuck's mind was the threat of losing his most valuable asset during the critical post-war period when studios were fighting television and changing audience tastes. Power's contract had 2 years remaining, and suspending him would cost Fox millions in unreleased product and future earnings. Zanuck capitulated, but imposed strict conditions. The budget would be modest at $1,900,000. The film would be shot in black and white, rather than the prestigious Technicolor used for Power's usual vehicles, and the ending would be softened to allow the possibility of redemption rather than Gresham's uncompromising damnation. Power agreed to these compromises, believing that even a diluted version of Nightmare Alley would demonstrate his range and free him from romantic lead typecasting. This is exactly why the studio buried the film in limited release and minimal promotion. They wanted it to fail quietly so they could tell Power "we told you so" and return him to profitable formula pictures. Director Edmund Goulding was assigned to the project partly for his technical competence and partly because he was homosexual and therefore considered safe by studio executives who worried about romantic tension between Power and his female co-stars affecting the production. Goulding had directed prestige pictures like The Razor's Edge and Dark Victory, proving he could handle literary adaptations and serious themes, but he was also known as a reliable studio professional who wouldn't indulge in the kind of artistic pretensions that might inflate costs or alienate mainstream audiences. Goulding approached Nightmare Alley as a technical challenge, how to make a fundamentally unpleasant story visually compelling and emotionally engaging despite its nihilistic worldview. He studied carnival photography and German Expressionist cinema, looking for visual strategies to externalize the protagonist's moral deterioration through lighting, composition, and production design. Casting the 2 female leads, Zena Crumbine, the aging carnival mentalist, and Molly Cahill, the innocent young performer who becomes Power's wife, required actresses who could embody radically different kinds of femininity. Joan Blondell, a veteran character actress who had been a star in pre-code Warner Brothers musicals, was cast as Xena partly for her faded glamour. She could convincingly portray a woman who had once been beautiful and is now desperately clinging to relevance through younger men and carnival fakery. Blondell brought depth to Xena that transcended the script, suggesting a woman who knows she's doomed but performs optimism anyway. Colleen Gray was cast as Molly precisely because she was unknown and unthreatening, embodying a wholesome innocence that would make her eventual corruption more disturbing. Gray understood that Molly's tragedy wasn't active wickedness, but passive complicity, the way good people enable evil through their refusal to confront it directly. The role of Lilith Ritter, the manipulative psychologist who becomes Power's partner in an elaborate con and ultimately destroys him, went to Helen Walker in what would become her most famous performance. Walker was a relatively unknown actress who had worked primarily in B pictures, and her casting reflected the studio's limited investment in the project. They weren't willing to pay for a major star opposite Power. Walker played Lilith with icy intelligence and sexual predation, creating a femme fatale who uses psychological expertise rather than physical seduction to control men. Her performance anticipated later analyses of the femme fatale as representing male anxiety about female professional competence and sexual autonomy. Walker's chemistry with Power was deliberately cold and transactional, emphasizing the mercenary nature of their relationship and avoiding the romantic heat that defined Power's typical pairings. Production began in late 1946 with extensive location shooting at actual carnivals and fairgrounds in California, where Goulding could capture authentic atmosphere and recruit real carnival workers as extras and technical advisors. The art department built elaborate carnival sets on the Fox backlot, recreating the tawdry glamour and desperate poverty of traveling shows with meticulous attention to period detail. Goulding hired actual mentalists and sideshow performers to coach Power and the other actors in the techniques of cold reading, muscle reading, and the verbal codes that mentalist teams use to communicate information. This research gave the film's carnival sequences a documentary authenticity that contrasted sharply with Hollywood's typical romanticization of circus and carnival life. The film shows carnivals as exploitative businesses that prey on human gullibility and desperation, where workers are underpaid drifters and performers are one bad season away from destitution. But what the cameras didn't show was the internal studio battle over depicting the geek act that provides the film's moral and narrative anchor. Gresham's novel describes the geek in graphic detail, a degraded alcoholic who performs as a wild man, biting the heads off live chickens while spectators watch in horrified fascination. The Production Code Administration insisted that the geek could be referenced but not shown, that depicting animal cruelty and human degradation so extreme would violate decency standards. Goulding fought for keeping the geek visible, arguing that the audience needed to see what Power's character might become to understand the stakes of his moral choices. The compromise was showing the geek briefly and obliquely, in shadows and suggestion rather than explicit detail, while the dialogue makes clear what the act involves. This censorship weakened the film's impact. Modern viewers often don't understand what a geek is, or why Power's final fate is so horrifying, robbing the ending of its intended punch. Power approached the role with unprecedented seriousness, studying con artists, carnival workers, and alcoholics to understand the psychology of men who live by deception. He insisted on losing weight to emphasize his character's physical deterioration in the film's final act, and he worked with a dialect coach to develop the subtle speech patterns of someone from working-class origins who's trying to pass as educated and sophisticated. Power's performance is remarkably internal and controlled, avoiding the theatrical gestures typical of 1940s acting in favor of a more modern, psychological approach. He plays Stan Carlisle as fundamentally empty, a man with no core identity who becomes whatever his current con requires, and who ultimately has nothing left when the cons collapse. Critics at the time found the performance cold and unsympathetic, missing the point that Power was deliberately avoiding the charisma and warmth that defined his star persona. The film's centerpiece involves Stan's elaborate con impersonating a spiritualist who contacts the dead for wealthy clients, using information secretly provided by Lilith's psychotherapy patients. These sequences required extensive research into the techniques actual spiritualist frauds used to convince bereaved people they were communicating with deceased loved ones. This wasn't an artistic choice. It was Goulding's attempt to expose the cruelty of spiritualist cons while acknowledging their psychological appeal, the desperate human need to believe death isn't final and that lost loved ones can still be reached. The film walks a careful line, showing how the cons work while also suggesting that the victims aren't simply fools, but people whose grief has made them vulnerable to exploitation. The sequences gained contemporary resonance from the fact that thousands of American families had lost sons in World War II and were susceptible to exactly these kinds of cons. The film's submission to the Production Code Administration triggered months of negotiation over acceptable content. The PCA objected to the geek sequences, to the implication that Stan and Lilith have an affair, to dialogue that seemed to mock religious faith, and especially to the original ending where Stan's degradation is complete and irreversible. The PCA insisted on adding a final scene suggesting that Molly's love might redeem Stan, that his descent into geekdom might not be permanent. Goulding and Firthman resisted, arguing that adding a redemptive ending would betray the novel's moral vision and turn a tragedy into false sentiment. The compromise was a deliberately ambiguous ending where Molly finds Stan and embraces him, but whether this represents genuine redemption or temporary delusion is left unclear. This ambiguity satisfied the PCA while preserving some of Gresham's nihilism. Cinematographer Lee Garmes brought a sophisticated visual style to the film that elevated it above typical Fox productions. Garmes had worked on prestigious films like Gone with the Wind and specialized in high-contrast black and white photography influenced by German Expressionism. He used deep shadows, low-angle shots, and disorienting compositions to externalize Stan's moral descent, making the visual style increasingly dark and claustrophobic as the narrative progresses. The carnival sequences are shot with a mix of documentary realism and expressionist distortion, suggesting both the actual poverty of carnival life and the psychological distortions of Stan's ambition. The later sequences in Chicago high society are shot with harsh, unforgiving lighting that exposes the moral rot beneath upper-class respectability. Garmes's cinematography creates a visual journey from gaudy carnival lights to the darkness of Stan's final degradation. The film's premiere in October 1947 was a disaster that confirmed Fox's worst fears about commercial viability. Preview audiences in Pasadena and Long Beach responded with hostility and confusion, with comment cards calling the film depressing, unpleasant, and questioning why Tyrone Power would appear in such dark material. Women who came expecting a romantic Tyrone Power vehicle were particularly disturbed, and many walked out during the film's darker sequences. Studio executives watched the preview results with grim satisfaction. Power's gambit had failed, and they could now return him to the profitable romantic formula he'd rejected. The film opened in limited release with minimal advertising, and Fox made no effort to position it for awards consideration or critical prestige, despite its obvious artistic ambitions. Critical reception revealed a sharp divide between reviewers who appreciated the film's ambition and those who felt it had betrayed Power's star image. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times praised it as a grim and fascinating fable and called Power's performance a revelation, though he noted the film's commercial prospects were dim. Variety was less kind, calling it a depressing descent into sordid carnival life that will alienate Power's female fans and satisfy no one, and accurately predicting box office failure. James Agee, writing in The Nation, recognized the film as something unusual, a Hollywood star vehicle that actively worked against the star system's conventions, using Power's glamour and audience goodwill to seduce viewers into a narrative that ultimately punished them for their expectations. The divide reflected fundamental tensions in American cinema between entertainment and art, between giving audiences what they wanted and challenging their assumptions. When the final box office returns came in, Nightmare Alley had earned approximately $2 million against its $1,900,000 budget, making it a commercial failure when distribution costs and theater shares were factored in. More damaging than the financial loss was the impact on Power's career. His next several films also underperformed, as audiences seemed reluctant to embrace him after seeing him as a morally bankrupt con artist who ends as a carnival geek. The failure validated Zanuck's initial judgment that the role was career suicide, and it would be decades before stars could take similar risks without destroying their commercial viability. Power spent the rest of the 1940s trying to rebuild his romantic leading man image, essentially undoing everything Nightmare Alley had attempted to accomplish. The most significant alteration from Gresham's novel involved the ending, where Stan's fate is sealed without possibility of redemption. In the novel, Stan fully embraces his degradation as a geek, drinking himself into oblivion and dying alone. The film's mandated redemptive possibility, Molly's appearance and embrace, fundamentally changes the moral calculus. Gresham reportedly hated the altered ending, feeling it betrayed his novel's thesis that certain moral descents are irreversible, and that American society's cruelty toward its failures is systemic rather than individual. This wasn't an artistic choice. It was the fundamental compromise required to get the film past censors, who insisted that even cautionary tales must offer hope for redemption and suggest that love and moral reformation remain possible. Despite its commercial failure, Nightmare Alley influenced the developing film noir cycle by demonstrating how far Hollywood could push moral ambiguity and protagonist degradation. Films like Ace in the Hole and The Sweet Smell of Success followed its template of charting an ambitious protagonist's moral collapse through increasingly desperate cons and betrayals. The film also influenced later carnival and con artist pictures, establishing visual and thematic conventions that would recur throughout American cinema. Its depiction of the carnival as a morally compromised space where American capitalism's exploitative nature becomes visible anticipated later works that used carnivals and circuses as metaphors for American society's corrupt underbelly. The film's engagement with psychoanalysis through Lilith's character reflected post-war America's fascination with Freudian psychology and therapeutic culture. Lilith uses psychoanalytic knowledge, patient confidences, psychological insights, therapeutic authority as tools for manipulation and fraud rather than healing, suggesting deep anxieties about the new professional authority psychiatrists and psychologists were claiming. The film portrays therapy as potentially exploitative, with Lilith extracting intimate secrets from vulnerable patients and then weaponizing that information for profit. This cynical view of psychoanalysis was unusual for Hollywood, which typically portrayed therapy and psychological expertise more positively. The film suggests that psychological knowledge can be just another con, that therapists can be as fraudulent and predatory as carnival mentalists. Tyrone Power never fully recovered commercially from Nightmare Alley, though he continued working steadily until his death in 1958. In later interviews, Power expressed pride in the film while acknowledging it had damaged his career. He described it as his most important work, the role that proved he was an actor rather than merely a personality. Power's insistence on making the film despite studio opposition demonstrated the limits of star power in the studio system. Even the biggest stars could be punished for challenging the formulas that made them valuable. Power's gambit had been both brave and self-destructive, confirming that serious dramatic ambition and commercial success were often incompatible in classical Hollywood. The film's treatment of its female characters reveals both progressive and regressive attitudes toward gender and sexuality. Xena and Lilith are portrayed as sexual and professionally competent women who use men as instrumentally as men use them, representing a kind of feminist equality in cynicism and exploitation. The film doesn't punish them for their sexuality or intelligence, unusual for 1940s Hollywood. However, Molly's virtue and passivity are ultimately valorized over Xena and Lilith's active agency, suggesting that traditional femininity remains morally superior to feminist independence. The film can't quite decide whether powerful women are admirable for their competence or threatening for their refusal of traditional female roles, creating an ambivalence that reflects broader cultural anxieties about changing gender roles in post-war America. But the algorithm of history has vindicated Nightmare Alley as one of the darkest and most uncompromising films of the 1940s, a work that exposed the moral rot beneath American success mythology decades before similar critiques became commonplace. Nowadays, it's viewed as an essential film noir, a bridge between the expressionist pessimism of German cinema and the cynical social criticism of 1950s American noir. Film scholars study it as an example of how the studio system could occasionally produce works that critique the very capitalist values the studios embodied. The Criterion Collection's restoration brought the film to new audiences who recognized its contemporary relevance. The way it depicts American life as an endless series of cons where everyone is simultaneously predator and prey, where success requires exploiting others' vulnerabilities, and where the only difference between legitimate business and criminal fraud is social sanction. The film's nihilism seems less shocking now than prophetic. Its vision of American society as carnival geeks show less like misanthropic exaggeration than uncomfortable truth. Nightmare Alley endures because it refused the comforting lies that defined most Hollywood productions, offering instead a vision of American life as spiritually empty, morally bankrupt, and fundamentally cruel, a vision that Tyrone Power's ruined career inadvertently confirmed. But let me know below, was Nightmare Alley a courageous artistic statement that sacrificed commercial success for moral truth? Or was it a self-indulgent exercise in nihilism that betrayed audience expectations without offering anything constructive in return? Did Tyrone Power prove his dramatic range? Or did he simply destroy his career for a role that audiences neither wanted nor appreciated?